Hello and welcome to What I'll Think of Next by Ballerscheff. If you'd like to read along to the blog that I take these stories from, you can find a link to that in the description. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. To have your hair stand up on end, to blink yourself away. Such phrases are easily understood, but until you do it yourself, you won't fully believe in them. So he supposed. Lewis tried testing his theory on himself. When had he first heard of these expressions, before or after he'd done what they described? He seemed to have known them since his birth. He knew that couldn't be. Yesterday a woman had heard him sneeze and said, "Bless you." He sneezed again and she responded in kind, getting angrier each time, as if it were his fault he were sick or that she had tied herself so tightly to that custom and felt she had to obey it. "Bless you," she said. If her tone didn't betray her, rolling her eyes did. He pretended to be oblivious and thanked her kindly. "No, that's all right," he said. He kept his eyes on her as he pulled out his pack of tissues through his nose and stuffed the used tissue into his pocket. "I don't have any," she said. "Wouldn't give you one if I did." "That's all right. Really, I've got some." He held the package at arm's length for her to see. She was beat. Her options were to repeat herself or to insult him further in a different way. He'd won by showing her his tissues, but she hadn't known it then. She walked off and thereby admitted defeat. These thoughts passed from his mind. They didn't seem to belong to him. They were something he perceived, like a vision or the crash of black and white that came from closing his eyes. He had stayed up all night, beginning by laying on his back, his arms out above the blanket, his sheets as straight as they'd been that morning, on his newly made bed. He looked childish in pajamas, but it was worse to sleep almost naked as he had done as a boy. He had gotten into bed at around evening and had drawn his shutters to make night come a little faster, if only for him. Looking into the near corner of his room, Lewis had seen how the two walls met each other and his ceiling. The far corner of his room was a flat blackness. He stared into the darkness above him and saw figures emerge from their hiding places. There wasn't much to look at, so what he saw was sort of fuzzy and entirely made up. It was as good as shutting his eyes. Better, even, since that way he could be totally relaxed and let sleep catch him unaware. His head was empty except for a mind that roamed the room for something to give it company. In his fantasies, would it be right to call them daydreams? He righted the wrongs of politicians and businessmen. He took the stage at the UN and threw himself before the world with a charisma he'd never have in reality. There were criminals among them whose crimes everyone had forgotten. The worst of them were those who mocked him and every other decent person by claiming to act for their benefit. They all should face justice. They should, he said, but when would they? What would it take? He raised himself to his waist, gripping his bed for support as he would a podium, and pointed an accusing finger at the wall as he whispered his speech. He hadn't meant to speak at all, but his thoughts were so powerful that they moved him to act. The world within him answered his protest with applause and results. Police made arrests by the dozen, cleaning out half of government or more, and entire boards of directors, hauling them from their mansions and offices with a roughness usually reserved for lesser men. "Dennis, what's going on?" a woman asked her husband, who came close to breaking off the buttons of his shirt with each jerking motion he made as he struggled with his handcuffs. Honey, I can explain. He didn't get the chance. Two officers wrangled him into their car. The news stations played and replayed this clip as often as they thought would entertain their audiences. The family's surprise was comical. Every one of them got their day in court and international attention, no matter how much they ignored the press. People around the world talked about what they had seen on TV that day, what the charges were, and how good it was to know people got what was coming to them. For months on end, the headlines ran as follows: X arrested, X put on trial, judge sentences X to life in prison. He and his Lewis and his followers spoke with one voice, just as his opponents did. Newspapers read by the dull, the psychotic, and the undiscerning tried to save them. Their columnists called for leniency and moderation. Lewis pointed at the wall and denounced them. His whisper was echoed more loudly by his followers. As the trials went on, the approaches of his enemies in the press diverged. The meek stuck to talking about around the matter at hand, referring to it as what they did. The bold addressed it head on, only to dodge the full admission of guilt that was obvious to any honest person who looked at the evidence. X and others were partly responsible for the war. They had to say that much. Calling it the war hid the scale of violence and depravity that those involved, from the merest soldier to the president and their cabinet, had committed. They had killed with bombs and bullets, and with corruption and negligence. As for board members, the press talked of lawsuits that hadn't gone to court as settlements. This was true, strictly speaking, but it implied that the two parties had come to an agreement. Really, these companies had won by attrition and their deep pockets. The public of his dream wasn't the one he knew from his years as a mailman, ignorant, loud, ungrateful, and demanding, and so they soon discovered these tricks. The papers reconsidered their strategy once more. But let's not also punish X's family, they said. Should his wife be without a husband, his children without a father? In our quest for reconciliation, let us not harm the innocent. Lewis read these columns aloud for his followers as a way to boost morale and show them the way forward. These speeches were spontaneous, and yet hundreds gathered wherever he spoke. Those that couldn't be there personally saw him on their TVs or heard him on the radio. Their enemies were right about not harming innocents. The movement should be as orderly as possible. Some mistakes were to be expected, but not tolerated. They should be clear in their goal, and families played no part in that. But what was that about reconciliation? They didn't really want that, he said. Nobody should. They talked about compromise as a noble thing, but they knew what Lewis and his movement were after. We're giving them a chance to come clean. That's what's noble, if you want to call it that. If the sentence were a fine, however small, the papers would say, if the sentence was a fine, however small, the papers said the stress and embarrassment might ruin poor X, and by connection his family, which would ruin X twice over because he was such a family man. The papers knew X and his friends better than they knew their victims, and believed that they had some insight to share because of this. Somewhere, somehow, they found people both literate and evil enough to write these articles. but they couldn't reverse public opinion, no matter how hard they tried to muddy the waters. Inside the courtroom, things were much clearer, despite the attempts of the guilty to delay proceedings. Their lawyers coached them well. The defendants answered every inconvenient question with, "I don't remember," and kept up the pretense even after the judge asked them what, if anything, they did remember. That was something they turned over to their lawyers, who handled the facts as obstacles to be overcome as gracefully as possible, or else to be buried in doubt and made unrecognizable. Had the cases been new, the crimes fresh, and the evidence scattered, yet to be collected, this might have worked. However, academics had settled these matters decades ago, not judicially with the power of the state to enforce their rulings, but by academic consensus built with carefully curated bibliographies. Many a historian had made a name for themselves by cataloging atrocities, which made this, so the judge said, one for the history books. The whole courtroom laughed, including the accused, who did so nervously, knowing what the remark meant for him and at the same time hoping he was wrong. The judge and jury were too intelligent to be fooled by any tricks, and too honorable to let themselves be deterred by promises or threats. The jury convened and came to a quick verdict, declaring the defendant guilty. The judge deliberated a short while before producing a sentence, life in prison. The defendant was stunned. Their nearest aide, their nearest aide held them by the sides and back, expecting them to fall over or worse. All their assets, the judge said, were to be seized and sold to compensate for the damage they caused. The headlines ran on and on each day. There was a new photo of somebody getting their comeuppance. Until there was nobody left to prosecute. He fought the world and won in the span of 10 minutes. The dream was over. His triumphs vanished, though what he felt in his heart was real. More fantasies came, not as lengthy or as appealing as this one. Lewis lay on his back again, his hands clasped over his stomach, a little under his rib cage. His chest rose and fell with the sound of air rushing in and out of his nose. He pretended to talk to his idols, whose responses he gleaned from their books and paintings, their interviews and photos. "Oh," he said softly as each guest appeared. One after the other, like they were waiting in line. "I thought I'd never meet you, and here you are." His bed became a chair. He could stay put and still receive his guests decently. Either they repeated what Lewis had heard them say, or what he put in their mouths, or said what he put in their mouths. Except for that, it was a convincing imitation. Some people talked over him so much that Lewis had to fight to be heard. Others were happy to listen as they secretly wondered why and how they'd been resurrected, certain that Lewis hadn't thought about it much. He made them almost totally real. What he could not do was reveal sides of them he didn't know. Their conversation went in circles, sometimes perfect circles and sometimes at a slight angle, but whether they went slow or fast, the result was the same. To know what he would do in a given situation was all right. To take responsibility for someone else was too much. His puppets fell to pieces under the strain of needing to think for two. This was a more intellectual exercise than the physical fantasies of his youth. In those he played an army or navy officer, crouching under bullets or steadying a ship amid violent waves. Both were forms of self-flattery, the one more concealed than the other. The night dragged on. The fun of dreaming went bad after a while. Overwhelming odds underwhelmed him. History's greatest were better than he could imagine. The fantastic was mundane. He wanted finally to sleep and be done with it. Get the day over and put it behind him. A vague dread seized him. That's what came from late nights, and he was facing the consequences, which he felt no less for having foreseen them. Without any fears to play on, his dread remained largely chemical, the result of the same low serotonin levels that everyone had at these hours, whether they took vitamin D tablets in winter or not. His explanation made him feel better. This was something he could separate from himself and conquer. It had nothing to do with him personally. He waited and waited, irritated at still being awake, sighing heavily and frowning. The feeling went. He had a brief minute of relief, like the lightness a prisoner feels as he is unshackled from a weight, and when that feeling went, it left him restless. He tossed and turned, twisting his blanket into a mess, clutching his head as if suffering from a headache. He shuffled into his living room and switched on the news. The TV's light pricked his eyes, rousing him to attention in spite of how he felt. Something was always happening somewhere. He got what he wanted, not what was good for him. Crises, explosions, the arrows of the charts they showed. The arrows of the charts they showed were as sharp as the curves of the lines, which made shocking predictions that didn't register with him as they should. No, the arrows of the charts the stations showed were as sharp as the curves of their lines, which made shocking predictions that didn't register with him as they should. The tone of the reporter's voice and the alertness in his eyes made more of an impression on him than the man's words. He squinted at the TV to weaken its glow. His mouth hung open and filled with spit. He swallowed. It was too much for him, he decided, reaching for the remote and shutting the TV off. He opened a cabinet and took out a bottle of whiskey, admiring the design. It was a square box with rounded edges. Its neck shot out suddenly from its top. It didn't slim, as a wine bottle does, gradually from its fat bottom to its thin mouth. It was simple, not minimalist. The difference to him lay in whether you built something from the ground up to work well and to look good, or whether you stripped down something perfectly functional until it was ugly and almost useless. The bottle was worth keeping for that alone. So what if the actual drink was probably the same as its competitors, except for the bottles they were shipped in and the prices they went for? Their marketing had paid off. He had bought it, hadn't he? To be self-aware in this way made him feel in on the joke, to have gotten one over on the company as they had gotten one over on him. Okay, good. Dignity required him to drink from a glass instead of the bottle. He swallowed a mouthful, half the glass. Feeling the whiskey go down, he knew it was a mistake. He had eaten so little that his drink hit him soon. He could feel the alcohol in his blood. With his glass in his hand, he looked off to the side and felt the hard beat of blood in his arm. The whiskey deepened his sadness, the dread from before, and gave it shape. He feared, stupidly and also understandably, given the time of night, that he would never get to sleep. That day would come, and he'd have to slog through it unrested and then face down another night like this. His thoughts extended into what could be, which in his current mood always meant disaster, however it came about. A nervous breakdown, alcohol poisoning, or liver cancer. What else was waiting for him? He set the glass down with what he thought was more force than usual. His nerves made most of the difference. Them and the audience, and when was his house as silent as this, except at night? Why couldn't he sleep? It was, he figured, the pent-up stress from the rest of the week, which mercifully hit him on Friday, giving him 2 days to decompress, and not as it happened. No, which mercifully hit him on Friday, and not as it happened, giving him 2 days to decompress. He mostly delivered the mail to places he didn't live, and could remain on good terms with his friends, and could therefore remain on good terms with his friends. He tried to understand those that yelled at him. What are they so mad at me for? He'd ask himself on his return trip. Had the question not been rhetorical, he would have asked them instead. Friday was his threshold. Past that, there was nothing to keep him in suspense, a state he couldn't have survived for much longer than Monday through Thursday anyway. His schedule became part of his senses. Continuing this metaphor, the weekend was an empty beige room, a place for him to rest. Working with the public could wear you down, if you let it get to you. That was Carmichael's advice. So don't, he'd said succinctly. Carmichael had been a mentor to him, as much as you could be for a mailman, and as Lewis had worked at the job, he had become his friend, someone he could talk to about whatever he had in mind. The way he saw it, Lewis had said, people had their own problems. Most let them pile up until the slightest irritation, such as the sound of a mail truck's engine, brought the whole tower down, in his case, down on their poor mailman. The kindest of them were the elderly, who were lonely, and the very young, who were friendly. They waved and thanked him with such earnestness that he couldn't bring himself to say he was just doing his job. One woman had given him an apple. Wait, she'd said, her arm outstretched as if to stop him from going. Wait, don't go yet. He should be leaving, Lewis thought, but did he have to? He guessed at his schedule. With some luck and little traffic, he could make up for the time he lost with his next route. She ran into her house, her package under her arm, and came out clutching his present. I've got so many, they'll rot if I don't give them away. He thanked her. Had she grown it herself? Her apple tree, if she had one, must be in her backyard. It is. Something in her shrank. He sensed he sensed she might invite him inside if he found his way over there after hours. If he found his way over after hours. You've got to go, she said. I won't keep you. He thanked her for being so understanding. Later, he gave Carmichael half of his apple. They ate together as Lewis told him about the woman. Talk or eat, Carmichael said, his smile contradicting the seriousness of his tone. Take smaller bites. Anything new with you? Lewis asked. Not really, Carmichael said. No good news and no bad news either. He never did get presents besides what Lewis shared with him. Lewis said it didn't matter. It was just the one time that anyone gave him anything. I never said it did matter, Carmichael said. On city, town, and suburban routes, they had to bike. The post office didn't have many vans and reserved them for rural routes. There, traffic was few and far between, as were the houses. Lewis admired the scenery, fields of crops and uncultivated grass, out of the corner of his eye, and sometimes he turned away from the road entirely. To look at the places he was traveling through made him feel like a trucker, only he wouldn't want to do what they did, drive for hours on end and try his hardest not to fall asleep. It was a trip they made all alone, with nobody else there to take the wheel. He felt unsteady. His head drooped, the first sign of fatigue, a small victory in this strange battle against himself and against so many other things. He turned to his glass and held it up to a light he could see from his window, which showed him it was half empty and gave it an amber color. He stood up, went to the window, and traced the light to the lamp on the other side of the street. It was a pinprick. He rested his eyes on the glow. The lamp was gentler than his TV. Impressive, too, how far it could reach. The windows of the other houses were as dark as his. They and the sky had the potential to be bright, which the rest of what he saw did not. Did he? The question wasn't as absurd as it would have been in daylight. There was no sign of people outside, which further proved he should be sleeping. He understood that, but some other part of him didn't. Maybe as many as 5 others were sitting by their windows, all believing they were the only one awake. He wondered what to do with his glass. He couldn't leave it out till morning. He drank the remaining whiskey quickly, as if a mistake so made was less bad than the one he dwelt on, and went to bed. Flat on his stomach, he hugged his pillow, one arm hanging off his bed. His eyes closed of their own accord. He slept, if just for 4 hours. The night, when he awoke, was as black as before. While he waited for sleep to come again, he tried to remember his dream, which was curiously difficult to do. The more he gave chase, the quicker he forgot it. He could still remember his fantasies because he had built them himself. Enough waiting. He had to tire himself out. He took his pajamas off by the window, the night acting as a curtain, and changed into a pair of pants and a shirt. After groping blindly at the foot of his bed, feeling the profile of each shoe for the right pair, he finally found his sneakers. Not bothering with socks, he grabbed his wallet and keys and went for a walk. If someone saw him, but no one would, he'd be scandalized to be seen wearing this. The night air was cool, which could be pleasing if he knew how to handle it. This was a balancing act. He wanted to flee that warm, stuffy house of his and also not spend too much time in the cold or work up a sweat, which would wake him like the TV had. He wanted a middle ground between the two, and standing on the balcony wouldn't do. The breeze blew away his thoughts. It was too light to shake the trees or to shift a hair on his head. It clarified things, made him pure because it was pure. There was no need for it to dirty itself for his sake. He touched the lamp he had used to measure how full his glass was. His living room window was small from here. He walked further through his neighborhood, touching the lamps as he went. The place was familiar. He asked himself why it shouldn't be so. The answer was that, well, he was tired and had whiskey in him and it was very late. Just as these conditions affected him, so too should they affect what he saw, somehow. Damn. He looked for the moon, a bigger and therefore better anchor in the sky than any constellation. Which constellations did he know? The Big and Little Dipper, some from Greek mythology, though he knew them by name, not by sight. He gave the stars new names till he ran out of both. As many stars as there were in the sky, his constellations used 5, 10, 15 at a time. The figures he drew with them weren't much either. In the end, he got lazy. That was a square, that was a line, that was a long piece of string. He sneezed. Taking this as a sign of having overstayed his welcome, he abandoned his project and went home. He opened his window until the air was new. His first fantasy of the night, the one about a worldwide uprising and a just future, and a better future, was far off now, so much so that the few hours that separated him from it seemed immeasurable, and they were, because he hadn't looked at a clock once the whole night through. He thought of expressions he hadn't used in a while, and of the rude woman from yesterday. Then he closed his eyes and thought no more. He saw neither night end nor day begin, and was all the better for it. That was What I'll Think of Next by Philip Ballerscheff. As always, you can find a link to the blog in the description, and remember to like, share, and subscribe.